Yes, all right. So anyhow, like I said, I really doubt anybody really pays any attention to what I'm talking about, and whatever. So, but since nobody's paying attention, that means I can, you know, go on more rants and tangents and stuff. And so that's what I'm going to do. So I want to go back into RamZ Paul. RamZ Paul's video today about, you know, the 3 easy steps. There's 3 very easy steps to solve homelessness. And this is just going to be basically a response to RamZ Paul. So let's break it down. I've already heard RamZ Paul talk about this before. Yeah. And anyways, so the 3 easy steps. So the 3 easy steps are based on the 3 categories of homeless people, according to RamZ Paul. So you can break homelessness down to just 3 types of people. Schizophrenic, insane lunatics. That's like most of the homeless are just schizophrenic, insane lunatics. And then all the other ones that aren't, they're just drug addicts. They're just addicted to heroin and fentanyl and stuff. And so you've got a step for each one of those 2. And then the third is just that very small percentage of people that deserve to be treated like human beings, which is really rare in the homeless thing, right? And so those people, those are just like decent people that fell on hard times. And so the 3 steps are based on these 3 categories of homeless people, because this is what homeless people are. This is what homeless is. So first things first. Obviously, RamZ Paul is an expert on the subject of homelessness. Obviously, because he has the 3 very easy steps to quickly solve the homeless problem. Because RamZ Paul's an expert on homelessness. He's probably done all kinds of research on homelessness and, you know, field study and, you know, field application. And he's probably talked to lots of other people who have a lot of experience and research on homelessness. And so RamZ Paul's an expert on homelessness. So first things first, we just got to get right down to brass tacks. RamZ Paul is an expert on homelessness. And the 3 simple steps to homelessness. Well, first, since RamZ Paul's an expert on homeless, RamZ Paul knows that it's mostly just schizophrenic, lunatic, insane people are homeless. So, and then whichever ones aren't like just totally insane, they're just drug addicts anyways, shooting heroin and this and that. And then the only other one besides those is a very small percentage that are just decent people that fell on hard times. So RamZ Paul, being the expert on homelessness, knows this, that these are the 3. And so RamZ Paul has the 3 basic easy steps to solve the whole homeless problem. So you just lock them up in insane asylums. That's easy. Gone. Problem solved. Like, you know, over half of the homeless problem is solved right there. You just lock them up. But then you got the drug addicts. Well, drug addiction is a crime. And so you just lock up all the drug addicts too. You can basically throw the drug addicts in the asylum with the schizophrenic lunatics. Just lock all of them up. They all just need to get locked up, and then they can be mandated injections. You know, because in any kind of scenario like insane asylums, they just force inject jabs into them of chemicals and stuff. So you're just gonna force treatment because they're crazy. And same with drug addicts. They're just criminal degenerates. All these criminal degenerates, just lock them up. Then all you'll have left is this little tiny sliver of people that are homeless, that are just decent people that fell on hard times. So that's 2 of the 3 steps. So the third step is all this minute fraction left of homeless people, because they're all mentally ill drug addicts, so those are all locked away. And then the little tiny population you have left, well, you provide them with little tiny small bathroom sized homes that are very uncomfortable, and because you don't want them to get comfortable. You really want to put the fire under them so that they'll do what RamZ Paul tells them. Because RamZ Paul's the expert on homelessness and stuff. And so if you put these decent people who've fallen on hard times and you just give them a home the size of a small bathroom, that'll keep them in a state of discomfort to where it'll push them to work really hard. Doing what, I'm not sure. Maybe doing a YouTube channel like RamZ Paul does. That'll be their job, is to work really hard like RamZ Paul does. RamZ Paul works really hard, you guys. And so then they'll be like RamZ Paul. And that's how you address the homeless thing. So, as I mentioned before, first things first, obviously, RamZ Paul is an expert on homelessness. Obviously. Self-proclaimed expert. I'm sure he's got all the receipts to prove it too, of him having this expertise on the subject of homeless poverty and stuff. He's an expert on poverty. He's an expert on the subject of poverty. He's an expert on the subject of homelessness. But not only that, he's also an expert in the field of psychology, because, he can diagnose homeless people and see that most homeless people are just mentally ill, because RamZ Paul is an expert on psychology, in the psychology of the mind. He's an expert. So he's an expert on homelessness. He's also an expert on psychology and psychiatry and the psychology of the mind. He can easily diagnose anybody. All he has to do is just take one glance at him and give you a thorough diagnosis of that person's mental health condition. And then he's also, on top of that though, he's also an expert on drug and alcohol addiction and recovery. So RamZ Paul is an expert on drug and alcohol addiction recovery, right? And he's an expert on, psychology, psychiatry, etc., etc. He's probably got a PhD in psychology and psychiatry to be able to just look at someone and automatically diagnose them as being mentally ill. I mean, RamZ Paul should be the leader of the world, really. He's got the answers to all of our problems. Everything that we're all just like, what do we do in this situation? He's got the easy answer. Because he's an expert on drug and alcohol addiction and recovery. He's an expert on psychology and psychiatry. And he's also an expert on the subject of homelessness and poverty. He's got PhD degrees in all of these fields. He can easily diagnose someone's mental health condition. He can easily diagnose, a person's drug and alcohol, and he's like got a PhD in the process of recovering from drug addiction and alcoholism. He's an expert on all these things, as well as an expert on homelessness. So that's RamZ Paul. RamZ Paul, he's the expert, right? So yeah, if only we could all just be like RamZ Paul, right? What a very interesting world this would be, is if everybody was just a clone of RamZ Paul. Wouldn't the world be just such an interesting place to live? I could totally see RamZ Paul just like one day ruling the world, where he's like the ruler of the world. And he'll be locking up all the insane people in insane asylums, and he'd be locking up all the drug addicts in prisons, and because it's a crime to do drugs and stuff. So he's going to imprison and lock up all the drug addicts and alcoholics, and he's going to easily diagnose and lock up all the crazy people in insane asylums, and then everyone else gets a small-sized bathroom home to live in until they can reach the level that RamZ Paul is at. And then once they start to reach a level more like RamZ Paul, then they get to move out of that small bathroom-sized house into a bigger one, because the more like RamZ Paul they are, the more rewarded they will be. Hopefully, unless RamZ Paul, maybe he's crazy, then he might end up being like a Pol Pot or a Stalin, and anybody that he doesn't like, he'll just say they're crazy so that they'll get locked up, and anybody that he doesn't like, he'll say is a drug addict, even if they just like smoke weed on the weekends or something. And then also like people that Paul Ramsey does like, even though they're addicted to big pharma pills that they get from their doctor, RamZ Paul won't lock those people up as drug addicts because those are his friends. Even RamZ Paul himself, as long as RamZ Paul is getting his drugs, his Norcos and his OxyContin from the doctor, well then RamZ Paul's not a drug addict because he gets his OxyContin from the doctor. He's not out scoring it on the street and stuff. And he does it in the privacy of his own home, And he just pops a pill. He doesn't stick a needle in his arm. So RamZ Paul's not a drug addict. So RamZ Paul is never going to self-admit himself into a drug and alcohol program, even if he was addicted to OxyContin or Norcos, because his doctor said it was okay for him to be addicted to those pills. So, RamZ Paul, he won't have to, it'll be a do as RamZ Paul says, not as though RamZ Paul does. So even though you might deserve a house bigger than the size of a small bathroom, RamZ Paul may disagree with that. And since RamZ Paul doesn't feel that you are worthy of living in a house bigger than a small bathroom, RamZ Paul is just going to make sure that you don't get a house bigger than the size of a small bathroom. Because RamZ Paul he's an expert on everything, and he's everybody should be like RamZ Paul. Then the world would be a utopia. We wouldn't have all these problems if everybody just was like RamZ Paul.